to Written in Uncertainty, a YouTube channel sat firmly in the grey maybe of the Elder Scrolls universe. My name is Aramithius, and today we're carrying on our readings of the Elder Scrolls texts with an in-depth look at the Monomyth. Now, this text is kind of foundational to a lot of people's understandings of the Elder Scrolls lore. It lays out an awful lot of the themes and repeating motifs that are part of the broader lore in quite simple terms, and so as a result it's kind of foundational, at least for me, in understanding how the world of the Elder Scrolls fits together. It was originally submitted to the Essential site by Michael Kirkbride before the release of Morrowind. There's quite a few texts that were submitted in this way, as far as I understand it, and it wasn't all in the one whole inclusive Monomyth text that you see in the main games. It was in chunks, and the Elder Scrolls Online has resurrected some of that earlier presentation to a degree. So what I'm going to be doing in looking at this text, to save you from listening to me rambling on at great length and without having time to digest, I'm going to be breaking it down into different sections. We're going to have the preface this week and then look at all the different myths in each of the weeks that follow on until we've finished them all. So, with that basis, let's kick off. It starts with a quote, which is this: "In Mundus, conflict and disparity are what bring change, and change is the most sacred of the 11 forces. Change is the force without focus or origin," and that's attributed to Oengithnia Tahiride, the Order of Sij. Now, that whole quote is from another book. It's from a book called The Old Ways, which is describing the Sijic perspective on the way the world works and how one should conduct oneself within the world, which is a little appropriate because you see later on, I think there are two myths that are attributable to the Sijic order as being presented to various people by the Sijics. At least one is that way. We'll get to that, and I can confirm when we get there. But that's worth bearing in mind at this point as well. And the highlighting of change as an interesting one, because the theme for most of this preface is that there's change that kind of echoes throughout Mundus and the same patterns repeat over and over. But there's that constant change that goes on. And just to highlight, before we get started in the main text, the 11 forces. We don't ever actually know what all of those 11 forces are. Change is the only one that's ever named for us within the series, but I'm going to go a little bit out on a limb and say that I assume that there'll be things like time and space, maybe, or at least maybe not space, because space isn't a force, but if you look at time and the related concepts like that, it feels like it possibly fits into how the Sijics are looking at the 11 forces. But anyway, back to the text. Simply put, the schism in the human Aldmeri worldview is the mortal's relationship to the divine. Humans take the humble path that they were created by the immortal forces, while the Aldmer claim descent from them. Now, this quote is a little broad in how it looks at things. The use of the word Aldmeri is a blanket term to suggest all elven races, all Merish races, although the only place you'll really see this sort of attitude at its most explicit is with the Altmer. There's not that much in the way of suggestions in other Merish cultures, apart from potentially the Bosmer, if you believe the varieties of faith, that explicitly state descent from the divine. And there's maybe one text that's a comment from Michael Kirkbride in a forum somewhere that says that the Dunmer view the Daedra in the same way as other Mer view the Aedra, but that's still not quite as explicit in how they relate to them in quite a few ways. And you've also got the notion that humans, that men, were created by the immortal forces. But again, that's hard to pin down and find an explicit expression of within other texts. And that's also different from how we see it in the annotated Anuad, which we looked at last week. That text suggests that both men and Mer are descended from the Elnafey, the wandering Elnafey and the old Elnafey, without much in the way of a suggestion of either being created. And that perspective does alter how the old Mer think about their relationship to the divine and where they came from, what they deserve in a way. If an old Mer becomes a god, or if a Mer becomes a god, that's kind of expected. That's just them returning to what they were before. But if a man becomes a god, then that's something that shouldn't happen. That's a created being reaching up to be a creator. That's not allowed, which is also why you see the Thalma taking such umbrage about Talos. It's a man claiming that they became a god, and with that kind of Murish worldview of we're descended, you're not, so you shouldn't have anything to do with the gods, explains that whole attitude. All Tamrielic religions begin the same. Man or Mer, things begin with the dualism of Anu and his other. These twin forces go by many names. Anu Padomay, Anuiel Sithis, Akel, Satak Akel, is not. Anuiel is the everlasting ineffable light, Sithis is the corrupting inexpressible action. In the middle is the grey maybe, Nern in the Elnafex. I do find it a little weird that Padomay isn't mentioned explicitly at the start, and you see later on that we get more echoes of Anu's double being a little pushed to the side, a little ignored. You look at the book Sithis, and it suggests that Sithis is part of that primal pair and not Padomay. And you've also got one or two sources like the Words in Sequence and the 36 Lessons that suggest that the Anu-Padomay duality doesn't exist at all, which this text very, very lightly hints at by only really naming Anu. And it also seems to suggest that Anuiel Sithis and Akel and Satak Akel, the other pairings, are all kind of on a level with Anu Padomay, which most texts won't tell you, which they'll generally say that Anuiel and Sithis is the next level down in the creational gradients, that Anuiel is the soul of Anu, Sithis is the soul of Padomay, and they are lower down than the beings that originally created them, which you'll see in some of the myths as we move through the Monomyth. In most cultures, Anuiel is honoured for his part in the interplay that creates the world, but Sithis is held in higher esteem because he's the one that causes the reaction. Sithis is thus the original creator, an entity who intrinsically causes change without design. Even the Hist acknowledge this being. And remember that the text at the start flagged change as a fundamental force in the universe and as something that is the most sacred of the fundamental forces here. So you've got that reiteration that Sithis is therefore more sacred than Anuiel, at least as far as the Sijiks are concerned, maybe. Although it kind of should be the other way around as far as I'm concerned. There's a text that suggests that the idea of Anu creating Anuiel, of subgradiating and creating his own soul to look at, it's the idea that Anu should not be able to do anything. If Anu is stasis, as is hinted at in this and various other texts, then it shouldn't be able to do anything. And so Sij, as a word that's a little difficult to get your head around, you don't know entirely how to spell it. I mean, how many J's are there in there? And that kind of incomprehensibility is core to the concept that Anu is the one making an action which is in response to Sithis' original action. Sithis is the start of everything. There are various texts that call him the start of all true houses, because it brings about that original change, that original drive for difference and distinction and so on. And on the final note, even the Hist acknowledge this being. That goes beyond acknowledgement in a few ways. It goes directly to worship if you look at the Argonian cultures. And that is kind of interesting because they potentially have a similar outlook to the Sijiks, maybe, if we're taking the Hist as worshipping change, thinking change as a good thing, which I think is definitely the case if you look at some of the Argonian creation myths. Then it's very, very similar to the way the Sijiks function, which is kind of curious. Anuiel is also perceived of as order, opposed to the Sithis chaos. Perhaps it is easier for mortals to envision change than perfect stasis, for often Anuiel is relegated to the mythic background of Sithis' fancies. In Yokudan folk tales, which are among the most vivid in the world, Satak is only referred to a handful of times as the Hum. He is a force so prevalent as to not really be there at all. And if it is true that he's present in the Yokudan folk tales, he's not really there to the same degree as we would expect this to be in there, and he's certainly not called the Hum in the Yokudan creation myth, which we'll get to as part of this series. But there is a kind of a fundamental truth there. Leaning on the Yokudan folk tale again, you've got Satak being everything and having to have nothing in order to even start to think and even be, is one of the quotes, that in order for things to exist at all, there needs to be something other than this constant noise, if you want to go with the hum metaphor, that is Satak. This one being that is everything needs space in order to make something different from itself. In any case, from these two beings spring the Etada, or original spirits. To humans, these Etada are the gods and demons. To the Aldmer, the Aedra Daedra, or the ancestors. All of the Tamrielic pantheons fill their rosters from these Etada, though divine membership often differs from culture to culture. Like Anu and Padomay, though, every one of these pantheons contains the archetypes of the dragon god and the missing god. Now, there's a fair amount to unpack here, so I may well wind up quoting stuff back at you from what we've just gone through, but I wanted to get the whole paragraph out of the way first. First of all of the Tamrielic pantheons fill their rosters from these Etada. From that description, it sounds like the Tamrielic pantheons are picking specific Etada to worship, rather than necessarily going with what the most obvious choices are. And you can see that in the way that the Altmer pantheon revere quite a few of their hero ancestors as gods, in the way that men don't really. You've got a few mentions of culture heroes within Mannish faiths, but only really Talos is the kind of the big equivalent of an Etada. The dragon god and the missing god. The dragon god is always related to time and is universally revered as the first god. He is often called Akatosh, whose perch from eternity allowed the day. He is the central god of the Cyrodiilic Empire. I kind of take issue with the notion of him necessarily being the first god, because if you look at the Daedra Nocturnal, she's referred to as the Dra, not the Daedra, but the Dra. The use of the prefix even in the way language works here, it suggests something primal, something proto, and suggests first in several ways, which means that Nocturnal potentially has a claim to also be the first god in some way, although it's also possible that as Akatosh is time, you kind of need a time god in order to have a first of anything. Otherwise, everything happens at once without any real causality or structure or order. You've also got the quote here, "Whose perch from eternity allowed the day." That is quoted in Michael Kirkbride's unlicensed text, Et Arda, Et Adra, Eat the Dreamer, in a way of thinking about what Akka, as is referred to there, is. One of the steps that potentially gets missed out within these texts, in the way that this text will be looking at the different pantheons, but you will hear the fandom discuss, is the idea of Akka as a unified time god that then produced Akatosh, Alduin, Auriel, all that lot. And the use of the "whose perch from eternity allowed the day" reminded me that there is a text out there that does do that in some ways. And you've also got the Song of Pelinal, who also refers to "O Akka, for our shared madness we do this," rather than Akatosh as such. We've also got the claim that he was the central god of the Cyrodiilic Empire. That is definitely true, but it's also worth noting at this point that he was originally a god of the Mer, that in forming the Cyrodiilic Empire, once her rebellion was over, Alesia co-opted Akatosh as the god that most of her subjects already worshipped, because they worshipped a Merish pantheon. There are some changes down the line that change Akatosh from a primarily Merish god to a primarily Manish god, but that's a subject for another day. The missing god is always related to the mortal plane and is a key figure in the human Old Murray schism. The missing refers to either his palpable absence from the pantheon, another mental distress that's interpreted in a variety of ways, or the removal of his divine spark by the other immortals. He's often called Lorkhan, and his epitaphs are many, equally damnable and devout. The difference between the human and Old Mary outlooks here is whether or not Lorkhan did the right thing. Men tend to think that Lorkhan did the right thing because creation is good, and the Old Murray view in this is that creation is a bad thing because it dragged them down from their divinity into mortality, which is a bad thing as far as the Altmer are concerned, which is also a very Gnostic view. If you want to check out how that works, I do some wiki searching on Gnosticism and how the different types of God, or at least the different types of spirit, all emanated from a central point and subgradiated, to use a word that I'm used to, into the various different beings, like the creator of the world and the angelic beings and so on and so forth. That's very much where the inspiration for this sort of stuff comes from if you're looking for a real world link. And the idea of souls birthing souls, which we'll get to later, is very, very Gnostic. We also see Lorkhan reinterpreted in Redguard myth as Sep, as a hunger, as an absence, something that needs to be filled, which is another way of looking at his missing status here. Note that Tamriel and the mortal plane do not exist yet. The Grey Maybe is still the playground of the original spirits. Some are more bound to Anu's light, others to the unknowable void. Their constant flux and interplay increases their number, and their personalities take long to congeal. When Akatosh forms, time begins, and it becomes easier for some spirits to realise themselves as beings with a past and a future. The strongest of the recognisable spirits crystallise: Mephala, Arkay, Ifri, Magnus, Ruptgata, etc., etc. Others remain as concepts, ideas, or emotions. One of the strongest of these, a barely formed urge that the others call Lorkhan, details a plan to create Mundus, the mortal plane. Now, some being bound to Anu's light and others to the unknowable void is another big absence of Padomay, in my opinion, here. We've got Anu and we've got the other, which is a little odd, because you've got some very, very definite perspectives coming out here when you hear people talking about the other gods that emerge later on in this paragraph. They've got a very, very definite place in how they function, and so Anu not having an other is quite conspicuous. It's also a little interesting that Rupkata is mentioned here amongst the slightly lesser ones, if you like, because he, if anyone does, has the role of Akatosh and the kind of overseer of creation and how it works within the Redguard pantheon. So it's possible that what this text is doing is trying to be syncretic about it, is trying to merge everyone together into one set of ultra pantheons, if you like. Humans, with the exception of the Redguards, see this act as a divine mercy, an enlightenment whereby lesser creatures can reach immortality. Oldmer, with the exception of the Dark Elves, see this act as a cruel deception, a trick that sundered their connection to the spirit plane. And there's your reason for the split. That men are grateful to at least be given the chance to potentially attain divinity, although that's not something you'll see advertised particularly in managed faiths. That you'll see people say that it's good that Talos managed it, it's good that Arche managed it, maybe, if you follow that line of thought for his origins, but there aren't that many other examples of people that attained divinity. There's things that are worshipped as gods, but their ascension isn't made so much of a big deal out of. You've got Raman as the spirit of human endeavour in the Writers of Faith, if I remember correctly, or something along those lines. And you've also got Morehouse, who was already some form of Ada, but you've not got that many others who have ascended into godhood. The Dark Elves are the big exception here as well. The Dunmer, who worshipped the Tribunal, the three living gods, for a good chunk of their history. Their way of looking at Mundus in general isn't really elucidated anywhere else, so I'll go into it a bit here. There are various texts that point to Boethia explaining to the Chimer that their place in Somerset wasn't how it was meant to be, that it was easy living, that it was too simple, that it was making them weak. And so they set out in order to make life tough for themselves, in order to make themselves into something better. Mundus for the Dunmer is a place of challenge. It's not a good place that's a nice place to be, but it is of necessity somewhere that is harsh and cruel and will cut you into better shapes. It will make the Dunmer into something that is worth respect, that is worth being something else, maybe, that is worth transcendence, if you like, but that's not a realm that's all sunshine and rainbows. It's harsh and it's cruel, but it does colour their understanding of the mortal plane. It means that they see the mortal plane as a good thing because it gives them a place to test themselves. It is a place of necessary trial, which kind of links up with the Irenaean theodicy, if I can delve back into real-world religion for a second here. Irenaeus was an early church thinker who said that people didn't actually have souls when they were born, that it was through the act of existing in the world and being in the world and living in the world that generated your soul. And through that act of being in the world, you had a soul and therefore you lived forever. It's not especially orthodox in terms of Christian theology, but it's very similar to how the Dunmer seem to see Mundus here, so it's an interesting point of comparison. Lorkhan. The creator, trickster, tester deity is in every Tamrielic mythic tradition. His most popular name is the Old Murray Lorkhan or Doom Drum. He convinced or contrived the original spirits to bring about the creation of the mortal plane, upsetting the status quo, much like his father Padomay had introduced instability into the universe in the beginning place. After the world is materialized, Lorkhan is separated from his divine center, sometimes involuntarily, and wanders the creation of the Etada. Interpretations of these events differ wildly by culture. Now, Lorkhan being present in every Tamrielic mythic tradition is in some ways a lie. I mean, you heard the stuff from the previous passage that's saying that he's a palpable absence in some pantheons. So he's obviously not there all the time. And if you listen to the second episode of the Selectives Lorecast, they have Michael Kirkbride on, and he explicitly says that he created Lorkhan during Morrowind's development in order to force a theological difference into the world, in order to force a different perspective on how mortals relate to the divine. Lorkhan is, in the real world, the reason for this mannish-murish divide and difference of opinion on how the world is meant to be. And I'd also like to point out here the use of doom drum. You've got in some forum posts that Kirkbride made the suggestion that Tamriel is a song. And the suggestion of doom drum here means that Lorkhan isn't part of the song, he's the thing that sets the beat, which means that he has quite a different role in how Tamriel functions. Which is also kind of interesting because if you look at some other texts, they refer to the doom drum from a Murish perspective, that the doom drum is a bad thing, but it gives him a very central role. I mean, the drum sets the beat for an entire song, and the other instruments often can't function without it, particularly if you don't have a conductor, but that's getting nitpicky. But that a culture which hates Lorkhan, that thinks he did a bad thing, would assign him such a pivotal role, an important role in the unfolding here, is a little telling, I think. The convinced or contrived difference is another mannish-murish difference here. You've got the mannish races generally saying that Lorkhan persuaded the original spirits to make Mundus with him, which is a little less deceptive than contrived or lied or deceived, which is the Murish view. There is potentially a way of reconciling this that I've heard explained, that the beings were potentially willing at the start to go along with it, but were then unsatisfied by the end result, and were tricked in the sense of, this isn't what we signed up for. They did sign on to create Mundus, but they didn't sign up for what it would mean for them in its entirety. There are some spirits that escaped during the process and became the Magna Gay, but those that stayed on potentially also, or at least couldn't leave, potentially could consider themselves tricked after the event, buyer's remorse if you like. And the final point I'd like to look at here is that Lorkhan is separated from his divine centre, sometimes involuntarily. Now, most of the narratives that we have around the creation myth is that Lorkhan had his heart torn out as punishment for creating the mortal plane, that it was entirely involuntary. But I'd just like to think for a second about what it would mean if his heart was torn out voluntarily. The effect of the heart landing on Mundus and imbuing it with a reasonable amount of selfishness, to quote some of the myths that we'll be talking about later, speaks to something that Lorkhan wanted to be put into the world if it was him voluntarily having his heart torn out, which means that Lorkhan possibly understood that mortality had to happen, that mortality and his own death, so to speak, or at least his own diminishment and scattering into however many different pieces, had to be part of the creation of Mundus, and that mortality is a necessary facet of this is really quite interesting, because you get an awful lot of overtones of self-sacrifice and missing out on something. If you look at the unlicensed text Vex teaching, that ends with the pointers that Lorkhan intentionally failed at Chim so that we might know how not to, or words to that effect. That Lorkhan is sacrificing himself and his own prospects, his own being, in order to allow the ones that will come after to be something more. And that's it for this week. Please join me next time when we'll be looking at the myth of the Arabis, a story told by the Sijiks about how the world came together. In the meantime, also check out the Written in Uncertainty podcast at writteninuncertainty.wordpress.com for some more in-depth looks at specific topics of the Elder Scrolls lore. And until next time, this YouTube channel remains a letter written in uncertainty. You've been listening to Written in Uncertainty, a podcast written and presented by Aramithius. The music for this podcast has been kindly provided by Jan Glembotsky. Check them out on SoundCloud under Songs from the Lost Land, and I'll see you next time.